So, in this period, we're looking at massive immigration. Um, the biggest wave of immigration that America ever saw. About 35 million people immigrated to America between 1870 and 1915, 1916. That's a lot of people. That's almost 30% of the US population. And this caused disruptions within the American system. These people came from places in Europe, mostly places that experienced famine or economic upheavals, and the people who came tended to be Europeans from South and Eastern Europe, which were different than the people who had come at first, because at first the initial wave of immigration to America came from Western and Northern Europe. And so when these new people came, Americans saw those people as fundamentally different. They saw them as darker, as more ignorant, mostly because those people were Catholics or not Protestants. And this caused people to feel a social and cultural disruption, much like many Americans today, feel about immigration. Also, people who lived in the North were dealing with the immigration or mass migration of African Americans who were leaving the South for better opportunities in the North. Um, and much of this was used to fill jobs that factory owners, that industrialists, that capitalists needed to be filled in northern cities. And this began to completely impact life in northern cities. But it also gave rise to these divisions, these economic divisions in America that we live with today, working class, middle class, upper class, and poor people. The middle class was largely a new class by the time we reached the end of the 19th century, and they represent something different than something we had seen before because most families lived in rural environments in which they worked on farms and families worked together as collectivizing. But middle class jobs, which tended to be managerial jobs, the husband could be the one and sole breadwinner in that family. This meant that children could go to school. So schools were much more developed by the time we reached the end of the 19th century. And within 20 years of this time, we're going to have compulsory education in America where all children are required to go to school. But in this period, only middle class children went to school. Working class children still had to go and work in order to make sure that the family could maintain itself because factory jobs were not consistent. They also didn't pay well. And a father, a man, the breadwinner, the male breadwinner of a family, uh, could not be certain that they could pay all of the family's bills. And so women worked, children worked when they could, but in middle class families that wasn't the case. And this gave women in middle class families a lot of free time. They raised children. They became the sort of backbone of protest organizations. Women in this era could get married. They could choose not to get married. They could go to college. They could get jobs. And so the opportunities for women were beginning to increase in this time. But within the Gilded Age period, there was also incredible economic disparity, much like there is in contemporary America. People wanted to explain why there were these inequalities, and so this gave rise to social. One of these was social Darwinism, um, and so you get Sumner, who becomes an advocate of social Darwinism in America, and he argues that the reason why poor people are poor and rich people are rich is because poor people are losers. They're genetic losers. And that rich people are rich because they're genetically superior to everybody else. And so your economic advancement is directly related to your physical or genetic fitness. that just like species survive or don't survive because they can adapt or don't adapt, um, people, this was attached to the economic and political world. And rich people wanted to argue that they were genetically better than other people. That's the only reason that they were, there was nothing nefarious going on. Um, that it was just that poor people were just genetic losers and they were going to lose, and therefore they should not be given equality in the system. So the government shouldn't do anything to help them. They should not be given any kind of political equality either, because they would then use the system to prop up their bad genetics. On the other side of that argument was Henry George, and he argued that, in fact, the system is not equal. There isn't a level playing field, that rich people, people who inherit wealth, did not actually work for that money. They inherited that money. And therefore, to argue that poor people were poor because they weren't working hard enough, when rich people were just inheriting money and creating what he called the aristocracy, an American aristocracy, he argued that something had to be done to level the playing field. And the only way to level the playing field was for the government to not only claim equality within democracy, but to also create systems that would allow regular people to advance, to work. One of the things he said was happening was that that wealthy people, especially people from Europe, one thing that's true today, as it was in the past, is that is that is that foreign investors were buying American land and then speculating on it, making large sums of money and leaving land empty. And George came up with something called the single tax theory, and he said, well, if you are a rich person and you own land, but you're not being productive on that land, that the government should tax you 100% on that land. If you don't make it productive, or you don't allow people to move onto that land and be productive on it. And he said, if people were allowed the access to land and the materials to achieve success, to advance themselves, that they would. But what's happening is that people who amass massive wealth, can essentially squeeze out all the people below them through political means and through their economic advantages. And he said you have to level the playing field. This gave rise to social thoughts like realism, and realism came out of this idea that, before people thought this idea about social Darwinism, but mostly because people lived in rural environments and they hadn't really considered, and it makes sense, like, oh, well, you survive like on the farm if you really work hard and you store your roots in the root cellar and like store grain for like the future. But in an environment in which you are relying on somebody else to pay you, or you're reliant on the capital of other people, that anything along the way could trip you up. And this became much more apparent in the Great Depressions of 1873 and 1893. And people began to look at the way the system worked, and and essentially argue that the system was disordered, that the system was chaos, and that it needed to be ordered. You have people like Veblen, who wrote a book and a treatise on the ideas that wealthy people in the middle class began to focus on consumption without dealing with the exploitation of people in the process. And part of that exploitation Plunkett points to, and that is that politics does not really have a lot of rules. So if you became a politician, you could essentially exploit the system. You could use inside information to purchase land and then sell that land to the government. This he called honest graft. Um, but Honest Graft and Plunkett's framing of of his success was very social Darwinian. That he was essentially playing that game. He was saying, well, anything goes as long as you get rich. And that was the social Darwinist ideology. Essentially, it doesn't matter what you do to get rich, just get rich. And if you do, if that's how you get, if you get rich, if you have money, that means that you are fitter than everybody else. Um, Many people would argue, of course, this isn't true. That's not really the way our system. That's not really the way the system works. But it certainly made rich people, people with a lot of money, feel good about themselves because not only were they wealthy, but they deserved to be wealthy, and poor people deserved to be poor. And this meant that the government didn't need to do anything to help them. In fact, under social Darwinists and Sumner ideologies, poor people could just die off. The government didn't need to help them. No, like, poor aid or anything, because that would, like, only encourage those bad genetics. All right, so I want that's sort of what's happening in this module.